Please listen carefully.
Hello, Team Anaesthesia. Welcome to GasGasGas. This is the best anaesthetic science podcast for the FRCA primary exam. Our goal is to fill your brain with all this highly useful information. Now, you might be in the gym right now, commuting, or ironing your scrubs, and there's no judgment here. GasGasGas will prime your brain for the monsoon of knowledge you need to imbibe. But regardless, the revision is eventually going to end. But for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Now remember to check out the website, that's gasgasgas.uk. There are show notes there with all the detail, plus links to foundational reference papers and anything else useful I find for you guys. Anyway, buckle up, get ready for your mind to be bent into a new shape, and let's get on with the show. Hello everyone and welcome to GasGasGas. Here is yet another episode. I'm sure you've waited these last 2 weeks trying to sit on your hands, trying to contain your excitement, but today we are elaborating on the oh-so-critical oxygen. Now, much like morphine, everyone knows about oxygen, don't they? We're all breathing it right now, hopefully. And you could be forgiven for thinking, it's boring, isn't it? And we all really know that anaesthetic science is anything but boring, because it is mission-critical to life on Earth as we currently know it, and naturally rather mission-critical for your exams. Because it's so important, you are expected to know plenty about it. And this episode will scratch one or two of those itches, because you need to know what we're covering today, how you obtain oxygen, deliver it to a hospital, pipe it to your anaesthetic machine, what the implications of too much or too little are. We're going to talk about too much today, too little. Well, we all know about that. But also you need to know how oxygen gets from the atmosphere to your mitochondria, the mechanics of gas exchange. You need to have read West's respiratory physiology, at least most of it, understand how hemoglobin works, what the alveolar gas equation is, what blood oxygen storage formulas exist, oxygen delivery formulas exist, the hemoglobin oxygen desaturation curve, ventilation and perfusion matching, which West would cover. It's basically massive. We're not going to do all that today, but one day in the future. But today, we are going to cover the physicochemical properties of oxygen that you need to know about, how we obtain oxygen for medical use. We're going to appreciate the pathophysiology and physiology of subpar oxygen use, and think a little bit about how oxygen is stored in hospitals. Now, if you are desperate to remind yourselves about vacuum-insulated evaporators, there's a Vivacast episode that covers just that, alongside a few other bits and pieces. Naturally, talking about oxygen does follow on nicely from talking about other things that are oxidizers, like our nitrous oxide, and that's because we touched on explosions in our Christmas special. Hopefully I'm not going to spontaneously combust during the excitement that is welling within me for this episode, but I think we should get on with it, shouldn't we? Oxygen, named as such by Antoine Lavoisier in 1777, is an elemental gas if you were to try to classify it. You will find it as two molecules bound, O2, in the atmosphere. There is no such thing as an isomer of atmospheric oxygen, and it is a colourless, odourless, and tasteless gas. It has an atomic mass of 16. But as it's floating around as a diatom is a fancy way of saying pair, two oxygen molecules, technical molecular weight is 32 grams per mole. How do we obtain oxygen to use in our anaesthetic circuits when we spank it up to 18 litres per minute to really truly wash out that circuit and we're going nuts? Well, you obtain oxygen through fractional distillation of liquefied air, i.e. you take air, you filter out the stuff that's floating around in it, all that PM 2.5, air pollution, etc. Cool it to minus 200 degrees C, and you'll end up with a vapor phase of nitrogen and a liquid oxygen phase that are quite happy to be separated from one another and can progressively be decanted out using fractional distillation. You might remember that from chemistry when they talk about the fractional distillation of crude oil into its variously weighted components in order to have kerosene and petrol and all that sort of stuff. Now, you don't just have oxygen and nitrogen in air. There's also argon, which tags along with the liquid oxygen. This needs to be removed as well. We're not going to go into that. Now, this oxygen is subsequently transported in its very cold liquid state and is pumped into vacuum-insulated evaporators at your hospital. You've walked past them, you've seen them, you've stared gloriously up at them. It may say BOC on the side, BOC, that's the company, and that actually just stands for British Oxygen Company. And that's all well and good. We know that that is piped to our anaesthetic machines down pipelines that operate at 4 bar, delivered into our anaesthetic machine, that are then down-regulated in pressure to 1 atmosphere of pressure, which the anaesthetic machine operates with. Without that down-regulation, that pressure would damage our anaesthetic machine. We're not talking Schrader valves, non-interchangeable connectors this time round. We'll have to wait. But that's not the only way you can get oxygen to a patient. Through your anaesthetic machine, we've got the flow meters in the walls, and then we also have tanked oxygen or cylinder oxygen. There are a few common tanks you will see. On the back of your anaesthetic machine, you will see a size E tank. 680 litres of oxygen in there at 137 bar. Underneath resus trolleys, you will probably see a size F tank. That's 1,360 litres, again 137 bar. But now, if you were to go and pick up a full handheld oxygen cylinder, and you all know the one I'm talking about, it's often white, and you can indeed pick it up. And if you look on that, it is defined as a CD tank, and this has 460 litres in it, and it is pressurized to 230 bar. So it's a bit of an outlier. And this is because the nature of the tank is stronger, therefore you can carry a convenient amount of oxygen around in a convenient form factor, the size of the cylinder. Now it's important to remember that if you were to try and get 460 litres of oxygen out of that tank, you wouldn't succeed. Those tanks are about 10 litres. Therefore, you would have 10 litres knocking around as a remainder in your tank, which is 100% oxygen, but now that it's equilibrated to atmospheric pressure, that's just what's in there. You wouldn't be able to get it out unless you squirted something else in there to displace it. More oxygen tank fun. These tanks are made of molybdenum steel, which is an alloy of obviously iron, carbon, a few other bits, and molybdenum that's nice and strong. But you also have Kevlar wrapped tanks. These are aluminium with a Kevlar wrapping to provide greater strength. And this is a composite material, which is lighter and more convenient. But now we got to think which is the better tank to use. And my mind naturally goes to what happens if you were to shoot one of these tanks. Some Americans, I think, have done this, at least with a steel tank. There's a link to that in the show notes. It's on YouTube. But there are two sides to this coin. If your steel tank was to unfortunately get hit by a stray round, and by the sounds of it, looking at this video, not just a 9mm prang from a Glock, but a robust rifle round, or something larger, not NATO 5.56, but something bigger, you will pierce this tank, and you will rapidly eject 136 bar worth of oxygen out of that hole. Now that's a lot of oxygen travelling quite quickly. This can convert your oxygen cylinder into a projectile, but also that amount of oxygen concentrated plus the steel causes a degree of oxidation and flame formation that can make that hole bigger as well. Check out the video. So you've got a hole in a tank that converts the tank to a projectile ejecting very oxidating gas at high speed that would support significant combustion if, for example, that was pierced inside an environment that was already on fire where there was material to combust. Sounds suboptimal. So now we look at our Kevlar tank and we're trotting through the battlefield, but then that gets hit by a round, and this is Kevlar and this is aluminium, so it is far more susceptible to lower energy projectiles. But Johnny Squaddy running around has a lighter tank on his back, so might be able to avoid said projectiles a bit quicker because he can move faster. But that tank gets hit. It doesn't just put a hole in it. The tank fails. It undergoes rapid, unscheduled disassembly and prangs off aluminium and Kevlar shrapnel at a speed incompatible with nearby life. This ultimately means that if you want to take oxygen to a casualty, 1, do it when there are not rounds banging around the place, and 2, take a steel tank and keep your head down. Hopefully that'll help you remember what these oxygen tanks are made of. The last FRCA fun fact that those swines may ask you to recall is the pin index of oxygen. Now, the pin index system is a means of preventing inadvertent attachment of one sort of gas-containing cylinder to an incorrect port, i.e. you wouldn't want to put your nitrous on your oxygen line or your CO2 on your oxygen line, for example. We don't use CO2 anymore, but they used to. We have pin indexes, which mean that you cannot successfully attach one thing to the other. The oxygen pin index is 2 and 5. Now remember, oxygen O2, therefore it starts with 2, so at least you're halfway there. I couldn't tell you of a clever way to remember that it's 5, but if you start with 2, you're already halfway to a right answer. I do not envy you. So on that depressing, despondent thought of all the bothersome things you may be expected to memorize and be able to regurgitate in an exam, I think we should just take a pause and think about the history of oxygen. Now, oxygen obviously has been around since the somewhat early aspects of the universe, but what about humans? Because, that's where we're really interested. And one of the first recorded notions towards there being something in the air that was involved in combustion and was consumed occurred in the 2nd century BC. And it was by a curious Greek person called Philo, or Philo, who knows how to pronounce it, of Byzantium. They had noted that if they were to put a candle inside a container that was sealed with water around the bottom of the container, or a mouse in the container, you would see the height of the water climb up the inside of the container as something inside was consumed. At the time, they thought this was the so-called elemental air that was converted to elemental fire. These observations continue to occur here and there. Leonardo da Vinci seemingly made an observation that combustion and respiration consumed the mass of air, and in 1604, a Polish physician cum gentleman scientist type named Michael Sendivogius described a substance in the air as cibus vitae, or food of life. They subsequently also managed to demonstrate that this same gas was produced when potassium nitrate was thermally decomposed. Thermally decomposed is different to combustion. This is where you apply heat to something and it breaks down. There are suggestions that a few other people also came to a somewhat similar conclusion at the time, but they struggled to align their findings with the prevailing opinions of the time. They failed to shout loud enough. They failed to challenge their colleagues, and therefore we remember Michael Sendivogius a tad more. What was the prevailing opinion of these times? Well, it was the phlogiston theory, which we mentioned in our last episode on nitrous oxide when it was described as a phlogisticated nitrous air. The phlogiston theory alludes to the fact that they presumed there was something in a material which burns off, and the remainder of that material is dephlogisticated, i.e. the bit that burns has been removed. So science continued to bash on the door of this theory, and whilst 3 individuals around the same time formally identified oxygen in air, undertook the role of combustion, as well as devising means of liberating oxygen from other reactions, our pal Joseph Priestley, who also tacks his name to nitrous oxide quite successfully, defines himself as the first person to publish about oxygen. So he was a busy man, discovering nitrous oxide and oxygen. I'd be lucky if I discovered a £5 note under the carpet. So there you go. A tad of oxygen history. And remember, named in 1777 by Antoine Lavoisier. Anyhow, time for a brief mention about the sponsors of GasGasGas. Teach Me Anaesthetics. These guys are behind an excellent single best answer question resource. Now, firstly, I took the joyful, challenging, and intermittent bashing through the 1100 plus questions they have written for the FRCA primary exam. Now, I secretly did love it, and there are plenty of questions to test your knowledge. Now, when I was studying for the primary, it didn't exist, but there were other packages online. These cost a lot more, and they didn't really seem to reflect the content of the exams. And whilst doing these, I came across rehashed MRCP questions, and I wasn't terribly inspired, and really I was a bit cheesed off. Whereas these single best answer questions have been built from the ground up, and they have not sniffed an MCQ in a past life. They are based on the anaesthetic science you need to know, and there are explainers with all the questions, so it builds your knowledge as you work through them. And there are also multiple different ways you can study this. You could choose to do a random battle with 1100 plus questions, or you can split it by subject area. You can go back and redo the questions you didn't get right. Very malleable. Now, if you've been thinking about which question resource you might want to get your hands on for the exam, you shouldn't really look any further than Teach Me Anaesthetics. If you reckon it's for you, all the links to Teach Me Anaesthetics from GasGasGas.uk. They are affiliate links. If you're signing up to Teach Me Anaesthetics through one of those, you're helping to support GasGasGas. So if you think you're going to go for it, click a link with me. You know you want to. You'll not only be supporting your exam preparations, but you'll also be supporting your 100% favourite Tell Your Nan Over Sunday Lunch podcast, which is of course GasGasGas. What about the physico-chemical properties of oxygen? Well, oxygen boils at negative 183 degrees C, i.e. if you have liquid oxygen at minus 184 degrees C, it'll be happily a liquid. If you warm it up 1 degree more, it'll boil off quite happily. What is the critical temperature of oxygen? Now, critical temperature, this is the point above which any amount of pressure will not liquefy that material. So if you've got oxygen that's at minus 100 degrees C, you could crush it in the center of the earth and it would remain a gas, too much energy. Whereas if it's less than negative 118 degrees C, it will acquiesce and become a liquid. This is why you will find vacuum insulated evaporators must operate below negative 118. Check out that Vibacast episode for more chat about the seemingly rather clever VIE that every hospital has. You've had critical temperature, therefore we should also talk critical pressure. Now, critical pressure is the pressure you must apply to that material at its critical temperature in order to liquefy it. So if you've got some oxygen at minus 118 degrees C, you have to apply 50 bar, i.e. 50 atmospheres, pressure to it in order to press it back into liquid form. Now, in an exam, they're probably more interested in you knowing what the boiling point and very much so what the critical temperature of oxygen is, because you can hang the conversation of how a VIE works off of those numbers. Critical pressure, less important, but just remember 50 bar. So we are trying to shoehorn oxygen into some sort of pharmacodynamic, pharmacokinetic concept, although it's somewhat challenging because it's not really a drug, is it? Even though we're meant to prescribe it. I always feel quite anxious walking into the hospital, knowing that I need a prescription for oxygen. Should I hold my breath? Should I breathe? Should I refer myself to the GMC or the police? Ultimately, I decide that I will cope without prescribing myself oxygen whilst I'm on hospital premises. And whilst I jest, there is very strong and robust reasons why we should actually prescribe oxygen to patients, which we're going to get ourselves into in a little bit. But what is the mechanism of action of oxygen? What does the body actually really use it for? And oxygen facilitates, as you might expect, oxidation, phosphorylation. This occurs at the level of the electron transport chain. This is found on the inner mitochondrial membrane of eukaryotic cells. What actually does it do? So, an oxygen atom is electronegative. It's got extra space compared to the number of protons it has in its electron fields, electron shells around it. Therefore, it's quite happy to accept electrons, or things that would offer up an electron. So oxygen's role is at the end of the electron transport chain. Remember, this is 4 molecules, so it's a complex 4 in this. And it merrily accepts 2 hydrogen ions and 2 electrons to form a molecule of water. Very hydrating stuff. What's the dose of oxygen? Well, hopefully, we're all breathing 21% oxygen. I thoroughly would not recommend hypoxic mixtures. However, once upon a time, anaesthesia did involve the odd hypoxic mixture, accidentally or intentionally. Now, there's a link to an article that describes in early 20th century the use of ethylene gas as an anaesthetic agent. And these very sensible folks, and I think the Letterman District General Hospital somewhere in the United States, thought, well, we best obtain some approval from the board before we do this, which was duly given. And then some of the doctors and some of the technicians agreed to be anaesthetised to really suss out how good ethylene anaesthesia was. However, their mix was 85% ethylene and 15% oxygen. And if you read the article, it is behind a paywall, but you might be able to figure out how to obtain it. They describe the patient's heart rate not changing, them finding it somewhat pleasant. Most of them were nauseous afterwards, and several of them were sick after. Most of them had a headache, but at no point did anyone mention that they'd turned blue. Now, back then, they didn't obviously have SATS probes, and you had to kind of wing it, didn't you? I think we're perhaps in slightly more sensible days where we don't just find an anaesthetic gas, think, oh, this works quite well, but we're not quite sure, so should we just anaesthetise a bunch of ourselves and suss it out? Madness. Right. Side effects of oxygen. Interestingly, oxygen increases your blood pressure when you're given more than you need. That's its chief cardiovascular effect. Respiratory side effects depends what you're doing to the patient. If you were to breathe 100% oxygen, eventually your lungs would perhaps think about trying to collapse, particularly at the bases. You've lost the nitrogen mass down in your functional residual capacity. That mass is replaced by oxygen. That oxygen is absorbed in these less ventilated areas of lung, leading to collapse of your alveoli. Another important effect is on the mucosa, nose, mouth, trachea, and the alveolar membranes, which themselves are not mucosal. Remember, they're an epithelial membrane. Will get dried out, especially with wall oxygen, because oxygen that's come from the VIE, that's piped across the hospital and comes out of your flow meter, has no moisture in it because it would cause things to rust and ham up, wouldn't it? So it comes out rate dry. If you're just inhaling that because you're on 15 litres, sat in resus for 2 days because of the state of the NHS, you're going to end up with very, very dry lungs. There is a story of a mountaineer, obviously high up a mountain, the air is really, really dry. And I don't know if it's true or not, whose mucosal lining dries out so much he basically coughs it out, but it obstructs his airway as he's trying to cough and splutter and something is going on, and he throws himself against a rock repeatedly to try and exert enough pressure in his chest to displace a wodge of mucosa that had sloughed off because it was so dry and desiccated that it failed. I'm yet to see that in a hospital. Yeah, there's probably one day soon. So oxygen messes up with your splinting, causes absorption atelectasis, causes mucosal upset, and also is irritant to the lung parenchyma itself, and we're going to get into that in a moment. Oxygen therapy is detrimental to eyeballs in premature infants. They can get retinopathy. And oxygen delivered to a person in higher than atmospheric pressures can lead to CNS effects. Remember, oxygen raises your systemic vascular resistance. It's a vasoconstrictor. It vasoconstricts your cerebral circulation, impairing perfusion, and ultimately can make you feel headachy, nauseous, sick, unwell, and develop seizures. And again, more detail in a moment. By this virtue, it sounds a little bit like oxygen could be a toxin in the wrong hands. Giving too much to the wrong person is suboptimal, and the quoted line is, if you're delivering 60% oxygen to someone at atmospheric pressure, you will see changes in their lung parenchyma in 24 hours. Now, we know oxygen is critical to life, but it is also a very reactive molecule. It's electronegative, and that reactivity is useful in a controlled manner to facilitate the reactions that occur in our mitochondria to power us. But there are challenges with operating with such feisty chemicals, and it is supposed that about 2% of your oxygen molecules that are meant to be behaving themselves escape the electron transport chain and become reactive oxygen species. Now, ROS, reactive oxygen species, were once upon a time called oxygen-free radicals, but then that nomenclature is a bit weird, because is it a radical with no oxygen? Or is it a free oxygen that's radical? So reactive oxygen species as an umbrella term is clearer. Reactive oxygen species will generally have one or more unpaired electrons in its probabilistic cloud of electroniness that is surrounding the nucleus of that atom. They can knock around, causing mischief, oxidizing stuff. The first two that you might expect to see are hydrogen peroxide molecules, that's H2O2, and a superoxide anion, that is O2-, whereby your oxygen, normally O2 floating around, but it is short just one electron. These can then subsequently react, forming a hydroxyl, OH, and a singlet oxygen molecule that is very, very reactive. There's a good BJA article linked in the show notes that goes into that in more detail. But all these reactive oxygen species would go off and cause mischief, messing up your DNA, etc. So there are a number of antioxidant mechanisms within a cell. These can be broken down into enzymatic and non-enzymatic. Non-enzymatic, your vitamin C, ascorbic acid, great antioxidant, as well as beta-carotene. And then enzymatic, uric acid and bilirubin seem to have an influence there. More oxygen, i.e. hyperoxia, increases reactive oxygen species formation, leads to a greater burden upon the intracellular antioxidant apparatus. Ultimately, you could describe this as causing oxidative stress to the cell. If we wind ourselves to looking at our lungs again, this can lead to an acute lung injury and potentially cause fibrosis. But if we were to broaden our horizons and think about other bits of the body, we know that once upon a time we used to put 15 litres non-rebreathe on everyone having a myocardial infarction. Ultimately, it transpires they didn't need that. It didn't improve outcomes. But also, that excess oxygen increases systemic vascular resistance, more work on the heart. It causes the epicardial vessels of the heart to constrict, less blood flow to the heart, and arguably increases the burden of reactive oxygen species you will find inside those cells. And if your cell is hanging on by the skin of its teeth in that hypoperfused element of myocardium, and then you make it work harder, well, it might just tip over the edge and necrose. So by that virtue, we can infer that oxygen isn't great if you have too much of it. So I'm just going to finish up on oxygen toxicity. I mentioned earlier that you get lung effects, you get blood pressure effects with hyperoxia at normal pressure. But if you were to go to 2 atmospheres and find yourself in an environment that is near 100% oxygen, you will start journeying down the process of CNS oxygen toxicity. This begins with headaches and feeling uncomfortable and unsettled, and progresses to visual disturbance, muscle twitching, and then seizures. And this is named after Paul Burt, who's a bloke, link in the show notes, who is described as the father of aviation medicine for his studies of pressure and gas on the human physiology. Now that's oxygen at high pressure. But what about oxygen that's at 100% at low pressure? Has this ever happened? And yes, it did. In the very, very early missions, those space cowboys took off of our planet up into the reaches of the stars. In the Gemini and Mercury missions, they were breathing 100% oxygen for several days as they tottered around the Earth with no notable side effects. And this is because the pressure inside the capsule was 5 pounds per square inch, or in our money, 34 kilopascals, which is approximately a third of atmospheric pressure, which is ish similar to being on top of Everest. Because they were breathing 100% oxygen, they weren't getting hypoxic. You really don't want a hypoxic astronaut, do you, when they're trying to make decisions? Then the pressure was low because it meant it was easier to engineer something that would tolerate the negative vacuum if the pressure inside wasn't so high. However, there was a disaster at NASA in one of the build-ups to the Apollo 1 mission where 3 astronauts were burnt alive inside a capsule they couldn't escape that was at 100% oxygen, pressurized, at sea level, where a spark ignited flames that burned them alive. They subsequently changed their gas mixes at atmospheric pressures to nitrogen and would switch to an oxygen mix once out of the pull of Earth They also made a number of engineering modifications to make it less likely to cause fire in the first place. Okay, now how about when we accidentally give someone too much oxygen in the hospital when they've got bad COPD? Now, I was taught at medical school that you would obliterate their hypoxic drive because they're only bothering to breathe because they're blue. It doesn't really work when you're a pink puffer as opposed to the so-called blue bloater that are mentioned in textbooks of yore. And this has subsequently been debunked because they've measured the minute volumes of patients with severe COPD, administered them 100% oxygen, and then witnessed that their minute volume remains the same, therefore obliterating that as a reason for why their CO2 may go up. And their CO2 sometimes does go up. There is a subset cohort of COPD patients who are incompatible with excesses of oxygen. Now, for the full lowdown on this, get on the British Thoracic Society website. There's a link in the show notes. Looking at their emergency oxygen administration guidance, there's a PowerPoint in there as well that has loads of interesting information. But ultimately, there are two things that are posited to have an effect. Alterations in your hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, messing with your physiological dead space, leading to bother, and then the Haldane effect. Now, the crux of the VQ mismatching is, clue in the name, hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. An alveolus that's hypoxic will vasoconstrict. So if you give someone loads of oxygen and get some oxygen in there, it's going to cause dilation of that capillary bed. Now, these alveoli are still poorly ventilated. What are the effects of dilating them? Well, one, you're going to reduce your pulmonary vascular resistance. So the right side of the heart might have to work a bit less. That's nice. However, once you've consumed the oxygen in that alveolus that it's challenging to ventilate because it's knackered and diseased, you're going to increase your shunt fraction. So you might see a drop in someone's sats. Maybe. I feel like the hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction argument for this is on thin ground. I've read a number of papers and it doesn't really stretch to suggesting truly why it causes the CO2 to go up, because the patient's minute ventilation hasn't changed. But now let's look at the Haldane effect, and this feels to me quite a bit more convincing. What happens when a patient has CO2 in their blood and hemoglobin in their blood, and this is venous blood, so let's say the sats are 92%. Well, that hemoglobin that's a bit deoxygenated has bound carbon dioxide. It's buffered it, sucked it up, tidied it away, and we call this carbaminohemoglobin. We know deoxygenated hemoglobin is better at carrying CO2 than oxygenated hemoglobin. That makes sense because you're delivering oxygen to the tissues and trying to pick up CO2 at the tissues to then return it. We need to remember that there's a hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, but there is also a hemoglobin CO2 dissociation curve. And when there's not so much oxygen knocking around, the affinity for CO2 goes up. There is a right shift. This CO2 affinity increase of hemoglobin that's deoxygenated is called the Haldane effect. So if someone is not so good at clearing CO2 because their lungs are diseased and they're walking around a little bit hypoxic, their hemoglobin is actually doing quite a good job of squirreling away CO2. Great. But now the F1 doctor rushes to the blue patient, panics in a fleet of madness, puts 15 litres on their face. Not the end of the world if you take it off promptly. Might cause some mischief if you leave it. If someone is blue, I still err on the side of give them oxygen. If you have control of a situation, titrate the oxygen. If they're unconscious, 15 litres. If they're conscious and able to talk to you and their sats are 70, just gently nudge it up. That's not the focus of this podcast. The focus of this podcast is we've given that patient loads of oxygen. We've oxygenated their hemoglobin. Therefore, that CO2 has nowhere to go but plasma. And it does. And this leads to an increase in CO2. Now, most of these patients are probably knocking around somewhat resilient to high CO2s and their obtunding effects. But if it were to spike significantly in a patient who has an exacerbation of their COPD, they're fatiguing, their CO2's creeping up, their sats are 88, and then they inadvertently get a load of oxygen. Now their sats are 100%. They've displaced all that CO2 from their hemoglobin. Their CO2 in their plasma spikes. That CO2 crosses your blood-brain barrier. It pickles your CNS. They become less conscious. Then you're in a downward spiral of badness. This sounds more convincing than some jiggery-pokery with VQ mismatch. If I'm wrong on that VQ mismatch malarkey, email me and I will pop a correction in here And that's fine. Naturally, all personal opinion. We could literally talk about oxygen until the cows come home, and as seeing as I don't own any cows, we would be doing it for a very long time. But there are just a few more fun things to talk about. What happens if someone has shut themselves in their garage, turned on the car, and tried to kill themselves with carbon monoxide, and their carbon monoxide level is through the roof, and they are sick as a parrot, and you just so happen to be near a Category 1 patient-accepting hyperbaric oxygen chamber in the United Kingdom? Well, you could take that patient and put them in there. If you take them to 3 atmospheres of pressure in 100% oxygen, you can deliver enough oxygen to their tissues to keep them alive just by the amount of oxygen dissolved in their blood. 3 atmospheres, 100% oxygen, you will achieve sufficient oxygen delivery and save their life whilst you slowly but surely displace carbon monoxide from their hemoglobin. And now, what about other oxygen-y type mixes? We mentioned saturation diving, I think, in one of the previous episodes. And one of the mixes that divers sometimes breathe is heli-ox. We've all probably heard about heli-ox. You could find yourself feeling very clever with a patient with airway obstruction secondary to narrowing who has high work of breathing and say, give them heli-ox. This is 21% oxygen and 79% helium. And, that makes them better. It only makes them better if they've not got a gas exchange issue, obviously. So if they've got obstruction and pneumonia, because they haven't been able to cough and clear their lungs, it's not for you or them. But how does it work? So air, oxygen and helium are similar in their viscosity. But what we're trying to do is reduce the density of the gas being inhaled. Because remember, when we think about Reynolds number, turbulence and all that jazz, the denser the thing you're trying to inhale, the more likely you are to have turbulent flow. Turbulent flow, more work of breathing, a challenge. Therefore, heli-ox reduces the density of the gas you're inhaling by 1.73 factor. Cracking. That person might start talking in a bit of a higher voice because you get a higher rate of flow across vocal cords. And now we've thought, well, that's a less dense gas. What about a denser gas? And what might that do? Well, a denser gas will make you talk in a very low voice. And for anyone who's desperate for some entertainment, there is a link to a video in the show notes of a bloke naturally on the internet who took it upon themselves to inhale some rather heavy gases. It's good because you can appreciate the tonal changes of his voice, but also he describes it actually being quite hard to breathe the gas out that he breathed in. Now, it doesn't mention if he also inhaled that as an oxygen mix or if it was like 50% sulphur hexafluoride, 50% oxygen, so he didn't get hypoxic, because if you were to just breathe 100% sulphur hexafluoride, you can imagine that you would go blue and possibly even pass out. And you would really kind of struggle to clear it. It's quite funny. Watch the video. That'll hopefully help embed in your mind the nature of the density of the gas being the thing we are interested in, as opposed to the viscosity of the gas when we're thinking about turbulent flow in lungs. That was actually quite a fun episode, wasn't it? With lots of interesting points made and stuff around the edges of oxygen. We talked a little bit about the history of oxygen, who named it, how it was approximately figured out and discovered, and who really stamped their name on it as a discovery, Joseph Priestley, by the looks of it. We've handled oxygen toxicity when you give too much to a normal person, oxygen toxicity in the context of severe COPD patients with an exacerbation, and dabbled on the physicochemical properties and side effects of oxygen. And I want to close out this episode with just one more thing. And this is when I was moseying around with the history of oxygen. And I've read a number of history books for medicine because it's just interesting. And there's often an allusion to a bit of a dark age where Hippocratic or Galenic school of medical teaching kind of got stuck for 1400 years. However, in 1250, a boffin, by no other name frankly, hailing from Damascus, called Ibn al-Nafis, reached the conclusion that venous blood crosses the lungs and subsequently attends the left atrium to get pumped out around the body. This was absolutely contrary to the prevailing opinion of the time, because no one could find the blood vessels in the lungs. The blood got from the left to the right side of the heart through pores in the heart itself, between the interventricular septum and the intraatrial septum. But whilst no one could find these blood vessels in the lungs, the pores also weren't visible in the heart. But the prevailing opinion everyone was stuck with was that this was the case. Ibn al-Nafis went contrary to that, stating what he thought was right. Now, there's a link to an article about him and the golden age of Islamic endeavour that occurred in this time frame, and it's less recognised in history of medicine writings that come about or you might find in a bookshop. It wasn't for a further 400 years that the alveolar capillary beds were seen, and subsequently this chap was vindicated. But this person was a discerning thinker. They had not allowed themselves to become trapped by the prevailing opinions of the age. We should use this to remind ourselves that whilst we think we know we're right about stuff, we do not know everything yet. We, you, I, medicine, may well be proven right or wrong in 400 years' time or less, because we have better technology now. Medicine should keep its mind open, not just purely think what the textbook says is right, but think about what the textbook is missing. Perhaps, when you come across an oddity in clinical practice, think about it in a physicianly manner. Is this something I could name if I could see more of it? And allow your curiosity to exist, because that's the thing that makes life interesting. Anyway, let's not get too philosophical. Thank you very much for listening to this oxygen episode of Gas, Gas, Gas. And I think we have succeeded in concluding the chapter on volatiles and other assorted gases that we might fiddle with. The next few episodes are going to tidy up a few more things to finalise a few more chapters. We're going to handle mivacurium and pancuronium, paracetamol, and non-steroidals. Paracetamol, again, more than you might want to believe is present to talk about with that, and non-steroidals, because they love to ask about the pK of aspirin, and there's that pathway of chemical action that often could come up as well. We shall see you next week. Thanks for listening. Ahoy, Team Anaesthesia! You've survived yet another episode of Gas, Gas, Gas. Now, if you found it useful or harrowingly awful, please like and subscribe, drop us a star or 12, and follow with whichever podcast platform you find yourself using. Please leave a comment or ping off an email if you think I need to square something away. Now, there are a bunch of ways to support the costs of Gas, Gas, Gas. From buying me a coffee, to venturing forth via an affiliate link, to the horde of joyful SBA questions from Teach Me Anaesthetics. Those links are on the website and in the show notes. Speaking of website, definitely check out GasGasGas.uk for the show notes, the diagrams, the details, the references. Now, we all know, guys, that this is a bucket of content to consume, and it is like drinking from a fire hose. So I want to finish by saying, take it day by day, don't overcook yourself, don't freak out, and keep studying.